You'll never be anything but a burden. That was my dad's favorite refrain. He didn't even say it with heat, just a casual finality, like he was stating the weather. I grew up in a house where failure was expected of me before I'd even tried. He'd say it over burned toast, over the rumble of his giant SUV idling in the driveway, over the radio static of AM talk shows screaming about the downfall of America. When I got a B in algebra? Useless. When I spent weekends reading instead of learning a trade? Useless. When I didn't want to work in his precious logistics business? Completely, utterly useless. By the time I was old enough to know better, I'd learned to measure my worth in decibels. The louder he sighed when I entered the room, the more I'd apparently disappointed him. He built that logistics company in the 90s. Box trucks, warehousing contracts, a small team of people who never lasted long under his micromanaging glare. By the time I was a teenager, he called himself an entrepreneur. But really he was a man in a faded golf shirt barking orders at minimum-wage drivers while pretending he was some titan of industry. I was never interested in his empire of half-failed invoices and perpetual stress. I took a job at the local library shelving books for $9 an hour just to avoid the endless lectures about work ethic. Every time I came home in my thrift store jeans, he'd watch me from his recliner with that look, like he was waiting for me to beg him for a real job. But I never did. He thought that was proof of my laziness. In reality, it was survival. My mother, God bless her, tried to stay out of it. She'd flutter around in the kitchen, filling the silence with coffee refills and forced smiles. She'd say things like, "Your dad means well," or, "You know how he gets when the business is stressful." As if there was any moment when it wasn't stressful. As if it was my fault he couldn't sleep at night. Once, when I was 16, I overheard him on the phone with my uncle, complaining about me like I was a defective appliance he'd bought and couldn't return. "He'll never take responsibility for anything," he said. "He'll sponge off us until I'm dead." I stood in the hallway listening to that sentence carve itself into my ribs, and I decided right then I'd rather starve than take a single dollar from him. So I didn't. I worked. Saved. Moved out at 19. Got my own crappy apartment with thin walls and a landlord who forgot my name every month. And as far as I was concerned, that was freedom. Freedom from the suffocating certainty that I was a disappointment simply for existing. We didn't talk much after that. Holidays were awkward, punctuated by tense dinners where my dad would brag about his successful operation, and I'd nod politely, wondering how many of his stories were exaggerations. I never thought I'd have to care about his business again. Until, of course, the day the IRS came knocking, telling me I was the co-owner of the sinking ship I'd spent my entire adult life avoiding. It started with an envelope so ordinary, I almost threw it out without opening it. No urgent stamps. No threatening bold text across the front. Just a windowed letter from the Department of the Treasury that looked like every other boring notice I'd ever gotten. I tore it open on autopilot, expecting some vague reminder about taxes I hadn't even filed yet. Instead, 5 words stared back at me like a death sentence. Notice of tax delinquency, business entity, Westbridge Logistics Group. I read it once, then again, then a third time while my brain tried to process what the hell I was looking at. Westbridge Logistics. I wasn't Westbridge Logistics. I wasn't any kind of partner. I'd never so much as signed a piece of paper related to that company, let alone sat behind the chipped laminate desk in my dad's warehouse. But the letter didn't care about my confusion. It laid everything out in that bureaucratic language that manages to be both bone-dry and horrifying. As a listed managing partner, I was personally responsible for more than $180,000 in unpaid payroll taxes, plus interest and penalties. The paper trembled in my hand. My vision tunneled until all I could see was my name printed neatly next to my father's, like we were teammates in this nightmare. I couldn't breathe. The fluorescent lights in the hallway seemed too bright, buzzing like an accusation. Somewhere behind me, my neighbor's toddler was wailing. Down the hall, an elevator dinged. But I was frozen, locked in the reality that my life, my actual, functional, hard-earned life, was about to be detonated by a man who never thought I was worth anything. I forced my legs to move, went back into my apartment, and dropped the letter on the kitchen table. My phone was already in my hand. I stabbed out a text with shaking fingers. "What did you do?" I watched the little, delivered icon sit there like a blinking dare. No reply. Of course there wouldn't be. I set the phone face down so I wouldn't throw it, and I started pacing. When you grow up being called a disappointment, part of you starts to believe it. Another part becomes determined to prove everyone wrong. And a final, smaller part just wants to disappear before you get blamed for things you never even touched. I thought I'd escaped all of that. I had my own place, my own job, a life that wasn't measured by how many contracts my father landed or how many times he'd remind me I'd never amount to anything. But apparently it hadn't been enough to walk away. He'd found a way to drag me back. I pulled out my laptop and started searching every phrase in the letter: pass-through liability, responsible party designation, joint and several liability. My heart sank further with each definition. No matter how I sliced it, the law didn't care that I hadn't signed up for any of this. The IRS saw my name on that form, and in their eyes, I was on the hook. At some point, God knows when, he'd filed paperwork naming me as a co-owner. And he'd done it without telling me, probably assuming I'd never find out. Or maybe he'd counted on me being too stunned, too ashamed to push back. Maybe he'd assumed I'd fold. I thought about every time he'd smirked over holiday dinners, bragging about how I'd never survive the real world. Well, the real world had arrived on my doorstep, all right. I shut the laptop and took a slow, steadying breath. Then I pulled an empty folder from the desk drawer and wrote one word across the front in thick black marker. Evidence. Because if he thought he'd picked the perfect scapegoat, he was about to learn how dangerous the useless son could be when he had nothing left to lose. The IRS office looked exactly like every nightmare you've ever had about government buildings: flickering fluorescent lights, beige carpet stained by decades of bad coffee, a cheap plastic clock ticking loud enough to make me sweat. I sat in the lobby clutching my folder. My palms were so damp the edges of the papers were curling. Every so often, a uniformed security guard would glance over like he was waiting for me to bolt. When the receptionist finally called my name, I stood too fast and nearly tripped over my own feet. "Follow me," she said without making eye contact. The conference room was small and smelled like stale air. A woman in a blue blazer waited at the table, a laptop open in front of her. She looked up with an expression that managed to be both exhausted and suspicious. "Mr. Holden," she said, adjusting her glasses. "I'm Agent Barrett. We're here to review your role in Westbridge Logistics Group." "My role?" I echoed, my voice cracking in the middle like a teenager's. She didn't react. Just swiveled the laptop so I could see. My name sat right there on the screen, next to my father's in a line labeled Managing Partners. Agent Barrett tapped the screen with a perfectly manicured finger. "According to these filings, you hold equal liability for all tax obligations incurred since fiscal year 2018. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. My thoughts were bouncing between what the hell and this can't be real. "I never signed anything," I managed to say. "I never agreed to this." She clicked to another document, this one showing my father's scrawled signature beside a typed version of my name. No matching signature line. No initials. "It appears your father filed amended articles of organization in late 2018, she said calmly, as if she were reading a grocery list. "You were added as a managing partner." I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry. "So you're telling me he can just decide I'm a co-owner without even telling me?" Agent Barrett folded her hands. "Mr. Holden, we don't make judgments about family dynamics. We only enforce the tax code." It wasn't an answer. It was a brick wall. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. All I could think about was the years he'd spent calling me worthless. How ironic it was that now my name was the only thing keeping his empire from collapsing entirely. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to be the soft target he'd expected. I took a deep breath and pulled out my folder. Inside were printouts of every document I could find, my own tax filings showing no income from Westbridge, emails proving I'd never worked there, old messages where my father mocked me for refusing to join the company. I have proof I never participated in this business, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm prepared to give you every record I have. For the first time, Agent Barrett looked up and met my eyes directly. All right, she said. Let's start from the beginning. I laid the documents out on the table, page by page. With every paper I handed over, I felt a little of the panic ease. I was still terrified. But I was also furious. And if my father wanted to drag me into his downfall, I was ready to make sure he didn't walk away unscathed. When I left the IRS building, I sat in my car for almost an hour, the engine off, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The seatbelt dug into my ribs, but I didn't move. I wasn't sure if I was numb or furious or both. All I knew was that something inside me had shifted. I'd spent my entire life believing that keeping my head down would keep me safe. That if I didn't challenge my father, he'd eventually just let me go. That if I was quiet enough, unremarkable enough, I'd slip through the cracks and never have to be part of his mess again. That fantasy was dead. He dragged me into it anyway. When I finally drove home, I didn't bother taking off my shoes. I walked straight to the kitchen table, dumped my bag out, and started sorting through every document I owned. Old tax returns, pay stubs, emails. Anything that could prove I'd never earned a cent from Westbridge Logistics Group. Halfway through, my phone buzzed. Dad, we need to talk. Don't do anything rash. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then flipped the phone over so I wouldn't have to look at it. I wasn't going to talk. I was going to build a case. I created piles, bank statements here, apartment leases there, printed emails in the middle. Each piece was another brick in the wall between me and his disaster. As I dug deeper, I found old messages I'd almost deleted years ago. Back when I first moved out, he'd sent them in a flurry of insults. Dad, 2019. You're making a mistake walking away. Dad, 2019. You think you're better than this family? You'll regret it. Dad, 2019. You won't last a year on your own. At the time, those messages had felt like poison. Now they were evidence. Proof I'd never been part of the company, only the target of his resentment. I printed every one and highlighted the dates. Added them to the growing stack. My apartment turned into a crime scene of paperwork. The couch disappeared under file folders. My kitchen counter was buried under sticky notes in neon colors, reminders of deadlines, legal phrases, IRS contact names. My laptop never closed, tabs multiplying until the browser looked like a city skyline. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I paused to stretch. My back ached. My eyes felt raw. But I wasn't done. I searched the state's business filings portal again, clicking through every amendment ever made to the Westbridge Logistics registration. My stomach lurched when I found it. Amended Articles of Organization, Managing Partner Edition, Michael Holden. Filed in late 2018. The signature box for Michael Holden was empty. Just typed text. Below that, my father's signature, sloppy and rushed. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temples. He hadn't even bothered to forge it properly. He just assumed no one would look. And maybe he was right. Maybe if I'd been a little more tired, a little more willing to believe the best of him, I'd have let this go. But I was tired of pretending. I copied the document, saved it in 3 places, hard drive, cloud storage, and a USB I labeled backup, just in case he tries anything. Then I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and wrote out a timeline. Every year, every contract I wasn't part of, every tax document that never listed a dime in income from Westbridge. I stapled the printouts to the timeline, one by one. By the time the sun started bleeding through the blinds, I had a binder nearly 2 inches thick. At the front, I slipped in the last piece, a notarized affidavit I'd prepared online, swearing under penalty of perjury that I'd never been an officer or participant in the business. It felt like armor. When I finally sat back, the exhaustion hit all at once. But even through the fatigue, something in me felt solid for the first time in years. He thought I'd always be the silent son who wouldn't fight back. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I didn't sleep more than an hour that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that line on the business filing, my name sitting there like an accusation I'd never earned. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait for my father to spin some story about how this was all a misunderstanding. He'd spent his entire life controlling the narrative. This time, I was going to get ahead of him. I called the IRS agent, Barrett, the second their office opened. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I have additional documentation, I told her. Proof I never consented to be a partner. She didn't sound surprised. Bring everything you have. The sooner the better. I packed the binder carefully, triple-checking the tabs. Part of me felt like I was heading to a final exam I hadn't studied for, but I knew more about this than I ever wanted. When I arrived, Agent Barrett led me back to the same small conference room. She gestured to the chair across from her. Walk me through it, she said, her tone clinical but not unkind. I started with the emails, printed records of my father mocking me for refusing to join the business. The messages were dated months before he filed the paperwork claiming I'd become a managing partner. I laid out tax returns that showed zero income from Westbridge. Copies of leases proving I hadn't lived at my childhood address, the one he'd used on the filings, in almost 10 years. Each page I handed over felt like prying his grip off my life, finger by finger. Agent Barrett studied everything in silence, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she looked up and met my eyes. This is thorough, she said. It strengthens your position significantly. I exhaled, tension draining out of my shoulders. There's more, I added, reaching into the folder. I found this in the state filings. I passed over the copy of the amended Articles of Organization. She peered at it closely, tracing the blank signature line with her pen. No signed acknowledgement from you, she murmured. That's unusual. Unusual, I repeated, my voice flat. I'd call it fraudulent. She didn't disagree. When the meeting was over, she walked me to the door. We'll be in touch. This may take some time, but you've done exactly what you need to do, document everything. Keep records of any contact from him. If he pressures you, let us know. I nodded, clutching the empty binder to my chest like a shield. Outside, the sky was overcast. I stood in the parking lot for a long time, breathing the cold air, feeling something I hadn't in years. Relief. I knew this wasn't over. My father wasn't the type to back down quietly. But for once, I wasn't waiting for him to make the next move. That afternoon, I drafted a formal letter refusing any responsibility for Westbridge's debts. I sent it certified mail to the IRS, to the state tax board, and, most importantly, to my father's office. 2 days later, he finally called. When I picked up, he didn't even say hello. What the hell are you playing at? His voice was low and dangerous, the same tone he used to scold employees who disappointed him. I'm making sure you can't pin your failures on me, I said evenly. This is family. He spat. You don't betray your own. I let out a hollow laugh. Family doesn't commit fraud in your name. Silence. Then, more quietly. You're making a mistake. No, I said, my hand steady as I held the phone. You did. When you assumed I'd stay silent. I hung up before he could answer. It felt like shutting a door I should have closed years ago. 3 days after that call, I got a letter from my father's lawyer. It was printed on cream-colored stationery, probably chosen to make it look more legitimate. The opening line alone was enough to make my blood pressure spike. Our client maintains that your designation as managing partner was fully understood and mutually agreed upon. I read it twice, feeling my jaw clench. The letter was 3 pages of veiled threats and smug assumptions, like they believed I'd crumble the second someone with a law degree sent me a strongly worded paragraph. They didn't know me at all. I scanned the document, emailed a copy to Agent Barrett, and CC'd the state tax board for good measure. Then I called a lawyer of my own, a woman named Carla Becker, recommended by a friend who'd survived a messy business dispute. When Carla picked up, she sounded brisk, alert, and faintly amused by the situation. Let me guess, she said after I explained. He tried to bully you first, and when that failed, he switched to legal intimidation. That about sums it up, I said. Bring everything to my office tomorrow, she replied. We'll draft a response. This is what I do. Hanging up, I felt an odd flicker of something close to optimism. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this. I spent the rest of the day scanning documents, labeling folders, and making backups. Every email. Every tax return. Every text he'd sent trying to guilt me. By evening, the binder was so full the cover wouldn't close. Just before midnight, I got another text from my father. You're overreacting. This is temporary. Just tell them you'll take responsibility so we can clean it up. I didn't answer. The next morning, I walked into Carla's office clutching the binder like a lifeline. She spread everything out on her enormous conference table, flipping through each section with a cool efficiency that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't doomed. This is good, she said finally. Your father has no signed acknowledgement from you. No evidence you ever profited from the business. No proof you even knew about the filings. Then why does it feel like he could still ruin me? I asked. Because people like him are used to getting their way, she said matter-of-factly. They assume everyone else is too afraid to fight back. She typed out a response letter on the spot, stating in no uncertain terms that any further attempts to assign me liability would be considered harassment, and that we were prepared to escalate if necessary. I signed it without hesitation. As I left her office, my phone buzzed with another message. This time, it was from my cousin Sam. Hey. Just a heads up, your dad's been telling everyone you're trying to bankrupt the family on purpose. I stared at the text for a long time, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Of course he was spinning a story. Of course he was making me the villain. But I didn't care anymore. By the end of the week, the narrative started unraveling. Word got around that I'd lawyered up. That I'd presented proof to the IRS and the state. That I had receipts for every single lie. One of his former employees messaged me late one night, saying she'd be willing to provide a statement. She'd overheard my father boasting that he broke the boy in to cover the company's liabilities. I thanked her and added her offer to my growing list of evidence. The next morning, the inevitable happened. I got a voicemail from my father, voice raw with anger. You think you've won? He rasped. You think you're better than us? You'll come crawling back when you realize you need this family. I replayed the message exactly once. Then I deleted it. I didn't need them. And I was finally ready to prove it. It's funny how fast the illusion of control can disintegrate. One moment, my father was the self-styled patriarch, the man who held the family together with nothing but arrogance and a dwindling checkbook. The next, he was just a cornered man whose schemes had finally run out of hiding places. 2 days after Carla sent the cease and desist letter, my phone rang again. This time, it was Agent Barrett. Mr. Holden, she said, her voice steady as ever. We've concluded the initial review of your documents. Based on your evidence, and the lack of a signed consent, the IRS will not pursue you for the liability. We'll be issuing an official letter clearing your involvement. I closed my eyes. My body sagged against the kitchen counter like someone had cut my strings. Thank you, I whispered. There's one more thing, she continued. Due to the nature of the filings, we're forwarding everything to the State Fraud Unit. You may be contacted as a witness. I wasn't surprised. I almost felt relieved. After I hung up, I set the phone down and stared at my reflection in the microwave door. My face looked older, tired, but more certain than it ever had. I knew what I needed to do next. I typed out a message to my father, one last olive branch he didn't deserve. The IRS has cleared me. They're forwarding your filings to the State Fraud Division. I suggest you get your own lawyer. I didn't wait for a response. Instead, I sent a longer email to a small local business journal, the kind of publication that loved a juicy family meltdown. I laid out the facts. The false filings. The tax debts. My role as an unwilling pawn. I attached copies of the relevant documents. I didn't do it out of spite, though if I'm honest, it felt damn good. I did it because someone had to tell the truth before he tried to spin it. The editor wrote back the same day, asking for a phone interview. I agreed. That evening, my cousin Sam called. He sounded nervous. You know he's telling everyone you forged those filings yourself? I laughed, an actual bark of amusement. Sure. Of course he is. He's saying you're trying to ruin him for attention. Sam, I said calmly. He ruined himself. The story hit the next morning. Local business owner accused of fraudulently naming son as partner to avoid tax liability. The headline was big enough that even people outside our family started whispering. I didn't read the comments, but Sam screenshot a few for me anyway. If true, that's low even for a desperate business owner. This is why you don't mix family and money. He did what to his own kid? The same day, I got a certified letter from my father's lawyer. A terse withdrawal of any claim against me, citing recent developments. It was over. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I thought I'd feel vindicated. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired but lighter. I called Carla and thanked her. She told me she'd continue monitoring the case. If the state decided to file charges, she'd let me know. Take some time, she said gently. You've done everything you could. That night, I finally did something I'd been putting off. I packed up the last few photos I still had of my father, old birthday parties, forced smiles, those rare moments he looked almost human. I slid them into a box and taped it shut. I wasn't throwing them away. But I didn't need them out in the open anymore. I was done letting the past take up space in my life. In the weeks that followed, the phone barely stopped ringing. Old family friends who never bothered to check on me suddenly wanted to hear my side. Distant cousins called to say they couldn't believe it, though I suspected they believed every word. I didn't answer most of them. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel obligated to defend myself to people who'd never shown me the smallest shred of loyalty. A few days after the article dropped, my father tried one last time. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, like some specter from a life I didn't want anymore. I knew it was him before I looked through the peephole. Nobody else knocked with that particular entitled rhythm. I almost didn't open the door. But some part of me needed to see his face when he realized he'd lost. When I swung the door wide, he was standing there in a cheap suit that made him look older, smaller. For once, he didn't start with accusations. You've embarrassed me, he said flatly. Not as much as you embarrass yourself, I replied. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. This doesn't have to be the end of the family, you know. I tilted my head. What exactly do you think is left to salvage? He hesitated. It struck me that he never had to answer that question, because he'd always assumed I'd be there, no matter how much he took. I waited, but he didn't offer anything. Finally I said, You spent my entire life telling me I was worthless. And when your empire started to crumble, you needed me to hold it up. He flinched. Just a flicker, but I saw it. You didn't just fail as a father, I continued, my voice quiet. You failed as a person. And I'm done carrying your failures. He opened his mouth to argue, but I stepped back and closed the door. This time, I locked it and walked away without looking back. For a long while, I just stood in the middle of my living room, breathing in the stillness. No more dread. No more obligation. No more pretending. A week later, the IRS sent the official letter clearing me of any liability. Carla called to say the state had opened an investigation, and I might be asked to testify. I told her I'd be there. I knew it wouldn't magically fix everything. There were still nights I woke up with my jaw clenched, still mornings when I had to remind myself it was over. But bit by bit, the shame he planted in me started to wither. I wasn't the useless son. I wasn't the burden. I was the one who finally stood up. One evening, I walked down to the little cafe near my apartment, the one where I'd spent so many late nights trying to figure out how my life had gone sideways. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the traffic drift past. And for the first time, I realized I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything, anyone, to validate that I'd done the right thing. I knew I had. When I got home, I packed up the last folder of evidence and slid it onto a high shelf in my closet. I didn't need to look at it anymore, but I liked knowing it was there, a reminder that no one was ever going to rewrite my story for me again. That night, I slept without waking up once. And in the morning, I didn't think about my father at all.